Okay, good morning, everybody. Gemar Chasima Tova and good Erev Shabbos. As long as there's been anti-Semitism in the world, there are different ways of persecuting Jews, different limitations. Early anti-Semitism began simply because Jews were different, and they were persecuted for not adopting the idolatrous practices of their neighbors. When Christianity became the dominant religion of the world in the year 316, approximately, the Roman Empire under Constantine accepted Christianity. And since the Roman Empire was most of Europe at that time, so being Christian in Europe, there were rules against Jews, primarily because they didn't accept Christianity. And that has been the pattern throughout most of history. And it expressed itself in a number of different ways. Among the rules affecting Jews throughout history, whether it was in the Christian world or later on in the Muslim world, was how they identified in terms of how they dressed, how they stood out in terms of the way they appeared. And the Jewish badge, the Jewish clothing, there are very specific hats they had to wear. It's a whole type of thing. It was clearly geared to identify people as Jewish, so you know who to persecute. In the modern world, not much has changed. In the modern world, if people are identifiably Jewish in certain parts of the world, you open yourself up to possible physical harm. In America, growing up in the 50s, very rarely would you find somebody wearing a yarmulke outside of shul. People who are observant, really very religious people, unless you were Hasidic, nobody was observably Jewish. People didn't wear a yarmulke in the workplace. People didn't wear it in academia. You just didn't see it. I think, in a positive sense, the day school movement, creating a whole generation of identifiably observant Jews, and wearing a yarmulke became more or less acceptable in the modern world. I remember when I was dating my wife, her family was a little bit shocked that I would wear a yarmulke in public. And I'm going back a lot of years now. I'm going back to the 60s now. Nobody wore a yarmulke to the theater or to the opera. It just wasn't done. Nobody in business. Today, it's not unusual to see yarmulkes in the workplace. Certainly in the New York City area, in academia. I never had a problem when I was teaching, for example, at Uppsala College, which is a Christian university, or at Queens College. I never had a problem wearing a yarmulke. And it just wasn't an issue. 50 years ago, it might have been. But today, clearly, being identified Jewishly by what you wear could be sakanos nefashos in certain communities, in certain countries. If you're the type of person that wants to go out and make a case, and I dare you to do something type of person, that's different. But if you're traveling in Europe, people are very wary of wearing a yarmulke in France, in Poland. You're taking a risk because there are anti-Semites who will attack you, perhaps. And wearing a yarmulke in public instead of a baseball hat or nothing at all could be dangerous. So the question that I want to deal with today is it permissible not to publicly identify Jewishly? You go out of your way not to identify yourself as Jewish. For example, If I'm applying for a visa to visit Dubai, can I write down a different religion on my application in order not to stand out? Is that permissible? If people want to change their last name so it sounds less Jewish, is that halachically permissible? And we know many people have done that. There are a lot of issues that we have to grapple with. And let's go back to, by the way, this issue emerged on Madison Avenue, the advertising world, in the, I think it was in the early 60s, where they came up with a slogan, think Yiddish, dress British, to deal with this particular phenomenon. But it was a real phenomenon. And my rabbi, growing up, taught English in City College. He didn't wear yarmulke when he taught, because that just wasn't done at that time. Okay, moving on. In Mitzrayim, let's take a look at Mitzrayim. We know that they were Shetufei Zimua, and they were in a very bad position in terms of being redeemed. However, there's a tradition in the Medrash that one of the reasons that they did merit redemption in Mitzrayim, Lo shinu es shemam es lashonam es malbusham. They didn't change their Jewish mode of dress. They spoke Hebrew, and they kept their Jewish names. It could have been very easy to assimilate in Mitzrayim, but they didn't. They stood out as Jews in the way they spoke and how they dressed and how they behaved. Again, perhaps they did this to avoid intermarriage. Whatever the reason was, they didn't change their observances. They kept bris milah. They did all kinds of things. In fact, we say it in the Haggadah. If you're paying attention to the words, Vayihi sham lagoy, what does that mean? The Haggadah tells us, Melamed shahayu mitzuyonim sham. They were distinct. They stood out by the way they dressed. So the question is, halachically, are there restrictions on what you may or may not do to identify Jewishly? So, for example, names that we have. Many people have very clearly Jewish names. Many people anglicized some of their names. You know, there's the famous story. How's it go again? Where, trying to remember it now. Where the person comes, I forget it. I can't remember the punchline. But many people, when they came to America, anglicized their Jewish names. And many people did not. Many people's names, they didn't have last names necessarily in certain parts of Europe. Their names were based on their occupation.
Oh, you're thinking about Sean Ferguson?
That's the one, Sean Ferguson. That's the one. You want to tell that story?
Sean Ferguson. No, you can tell it.
Sean Ferguson, yeah.
And it's a very famous story where who doesn't speak English is coming to America, and they keep on telling him to repeat your name in English. When they ask you your name, this is what your name is. And they rehearsed it with him. And he gets to Ellis Island, and he gets all flustered, and they ask you, what's your name, sir? And he says, Sean Ferguson.
I already forgot.
That became Sean Ferguson. You know, but that's a humorous way of looking at it, that many people literally adopted new names when they got off the boat. Rav Moshe Schick, one of the outstanding students of the Chassam Sofer, was very, very opposed, among other rabbis, to even using secular names. Even though, by the way, I mean, we know in the Gemara, many rabbis had Greek names, because that was the culture in which they lived, and that was the name that they were given. But Rav Moshe Schick was very, very opposed to using secular names, even though you may be called up to the Torah with your Jewish name and other religious occasions. As a matter of fact, his name, Shik, and the name Shik today is not a name. It's a abbreviation for Shem Yisrael Kodesh. And that's how the name was written. Shin Yud, quotation mark, Kuf. It was written that way. An abbreviation, because he didn't like secular names. The Rogachover in the early 20th century says that names that might be translations are permissible, but names that are totally secular should not be used. Now, Moshe Feinstein had several chuvos about this, and he said, "No, first of all, we know there are many great tzaddikim in Jewish history that had secular names. However, he says that you should have a Jewish name whatever possible, because that's the only way to distinguish somebody as a Jew. And you stand out. It's important to stand out, to be proud as a Jew." So he was not a fan of concealing one's identity. However, there are situations which might, let's say, allow it, but or not encourage it. But if you're threatened, your life is threatened. Even then, I mean, the Gemara says, if during a time of persecution, if they force you to do something, even to tie your shoelaces the way the Goyim changed their shoelaces, you're not allowed to do it. There are three things that you may not do under pain of death: Gili Arroyo, Shvichas Damim, right? And conversion, or anything that might involve adopting another religion. So you can't even change the way you tie your shoes if it's done as an act of persecution. However, there are situations where you are allowed to conceal your identity under certain circumstances. For example, and this, by the way, is I hate to say it's an unfortunate halacha, but there are some people in our community who take advantage of this halacha and totally misinterpret it. The Persian government and other governments charged inordinately high taxes to Jews, more than was usual. So the Gemara says a person is allowed to say, "I'm not Jewish," to avoid paying this punitive tax. Right? Because your parnasa was at stake here. It was a discriminatory tax against Jews. So it's not necessarily a violation of Dina de Malchusa Dina, following the rules of the country in which you live. But if it's a discriminatory tax, you can avoid it. But unfortunately, some people interpret this to avoid anything the government asks from you. Rav Meir was running away from the Romans at one time, and he ran into a brothel, or he may believe he was eating non-kosher food, and they left him alone because he appeared to be a non-Jew. So he concealed his identity as a Jew in order to save his life. So when you're not doing it to worship Avodah Zarah, but you're doing it to save your life, obviously, so that would be appropriate. So if you're in a community that's known to be anti-Semitic, you don't have to dress like a Jew. You can dress like you blend in like everybody else, simply to save your life or to avoid being attacked. And there are a couple of Gemaras where Talmidim change their clothing to look like non-Jews in order to save their lives. So, again, you are allowed to conceal your identity if you are in danger of being harmed. So that means that if you are in a foreign country or even in a rough neighborhood, don't wear a yarmulke, wear a baseball hat. And if you don't have a baseball hat, go bareheaded. Because you don't have to look for trouble. Again, there are people, the Meir Kahane activists who look for trouble. That's a different category. But clearly, you can't appear to be a non-Jew or worshiping non-Jewish practices. It's just a question of appearances. So there are situations which would allow for it. the famous situation, the Jews of Yemen. The Jews of Yemen were forced to convert to Islam. And again, they didn't do it willingly, number one. They didn't do it as a matter of faith. They did to save their lives. Because at that point, not everybody accepted the Pact of Omar, which allowed Jews to practice their religion, but they were forced to observe Islam. And the Rambam endeared himself to the entire Yemenite community by saying, when they were able to free themselves from Muslim oppression, they could go back to living their life as full Jews without doing anything special, because their conversion was not considered a legitimate conversion. And this is why the Yemenite Jews until today revere the Rambam, and they include his name in the Kaddish. They still say this in their Kaddish today. So clearly, you're not doing it because you believe in Islam or you believe in Christianity. Now, it's interesting, though, and this is something that is a very sad but important part of our history. In the Muslim lands, when they were first to blend in and be Muslims, most of them did. In the Ashkenazic countries, during the Crusades, when they had to kiss the cross or die, not only did many Jews in many communities allow themselves to be killed, but some actually killed their own families and committed suicide rather than forcibly convert to Christianity. They could have gone through a sham conversion, but in a time of persecution, they chose death rather than accepting conversion. Okay, so when people know that you're doing something, not because you believe it, you're doing it to avoid taxes, you're doing it to avoid persecution or being attacked, then it's not considered a chilul Hashem, and it would be permissible. Even to the point that you might be allowed to wear shatnez. There's a case in the Gemara about paying taxes on certain clothing. There's a bigger question to avoid taxes, but the taxes they're avoiding in the Gemara are, I guess you'd call them illegitimate taxes or persecution-geared taxes. But today, Dina de Malchusa Dina, Jews are not persecuted financially today by the government, put it that way. There are individuals within society that would persecute Jews, but clearly today, to avoid taxes in an illegal or dishonest way is clearly prohibited. All right, the technical discussion of whether you can wear shatnez to avoid taxes, that took place in the Middle Ages, doesn't apply to us today. Non-Jewish clothing is a fascinating discussion. Excuse me. Do you have to dress the way the Goyim dress? Again, if you're doing it for religious reasons or persecution reasons, that's one category. If you're doing it just because you dress that way, it's not a problem. There are tshuvos that, according to the Rosh and according to Tshuvas Hadeshen, you shouldn't dress in a way that identifies you as a non-Jew, even without shatnez. You should dress, Jewishly. But again, if it's a sakana to go out in the streets dressed that way, then you can conceal your identity or dress the way that today, with the exception of the Haredi community, most people are not clearly identifiable by the way they dress. We dress like everybody else. The more right-wing elements of our community might dress in a way that identifies them. Clearly, the wide-brimmed black hats and the black suits and the white shirts clearly identifies you. But then again, if you wear a colored necktie and a blue shirt, then you're not necessarily identified Jewishly. Practical halacha, to avoid being harmed, you can dress any way you want. one should try to be ambiguous if you were asked if you're Jewish or not, but that doesn't apply, I would hope, in our situations today. Again, given the high level of anti-Semitism in certain countries and in certain communities, and now with the politicization of the war in Gaza, and whether you support Israel or not, and if you walk on certain campuses and you're wearing a yarmulke, the pro-Palestinian mob might come after you. So clearly, you're not violating Chukas Akum in any way to wear a baseball hat under those circumstances. There are interesting practical questions in terms of rabbis. In some countries, rabbis have to wear clerical garb, like all the ministers and priests. In Great Britain, it's hard to tell a rabbi from a minister because they wear the same garments. When I was in Montreal, all the rabbis wore clerical garb. It's very English oriented. I was one of 3 rabbis in the city of Montreal who didn't wear clerical garb. I remember the first time I did a funeral in Montreal, Paperman's Funeral Home, the big funeral home, and they led me to a closet, and there were gowns in every possible size. Pick one. And I said, well, this rabbi doesn't wear gowns. And they were very upset about that. But clearly, so these are things that are not a problem, which were dealt with by earlier poskim. You shouldn't put yourself in a position where you're forced to dress like a non-Jew. But again, Sakanas Nefashos trumps everything else. In the 16th century, there are a number of secret Jews, crypto Jews, who took on non-Jewish names to hide their identity. And now that they're able to live freely as Jews in Amsterdam or other places, but in business, everybody knows them by their non-Jewish names. Can you continue using your non-Jewish name when you're no longer afraid of persecution? And the Shmuel de Medina paskins yes, because you're not doing it to hide your name or to disguise Judaism. Okay. Finally, let's talk about, I don't know, for want of a better term, Jewish pride. Why were Yosef's bones brought to Eretz Yisrael and not Moshe Rabbeinu's? So one fascinating medrash, actually. When Moshe shows up in Yisro's backyard, he asks his daughters, I mean, who is this guy that you're bringing home? And his daughter said, Ish Mitzri, Hitzilon Miyad Haroim. This Egyptian guy saved us from the shepherds. He should have corrected Yisro's daughter and said, Ish Ivri. I'm not an Egyptian, I'm a Jew. And because he didn't make that correction, so his bones were not brought back to Eretz Yisrael. That's one shot. And Yehuda Chassid actually says, if you hear yourself described as a non-Jew, based on this, you should correct them. Because, again, if you're not living in a time where there's persecution, there's no reason to hide it. And certainly something you should be proud of. And the other versions, Rabbi Yonah, the Bach. There's an interesting question. The Bach, if you're traveling in a caravan, and you were stopped by a bunch of bandits, and they ask you, anybody here Jewish? And you kept quiet. Do you have to do tshuva for that? So other Mefarshim say, no, you don't. But if you feel guilty, you should fast. So there's a lot of personal attitudes towards your Jewishness. Today, in, I would say, most places, it's not a problem. People have accepted the fact that there are Jews who walk around with kippot. There are even Jews who walk around with tzitzis out. although it may not be a good idea in some neighborhoods. But then again, it's accepted. There are enough people that do it now that it becomes accepted, and they're recognized without necessarily being persecuted for that. Some hold that it's a kiyum of Yahavt es Hashem Elokecha. Be proud of your Jewishness. Don't be ashamed of it. On the other hand, you have to be careful about safety as well. So the bottom line, if you're faced with an issue of concealing your identity in public, you have to factor in how others might perceive your behavior. Ideally, obviously, don't be ashamed of being Jewish. But in certain situations, if you're on an airplane, and the way you behave, if you're traveling in a large family group, you have to consider it. Again, it bothers me sometimes that people aren't aware of it. You have large Jewish families who can sometimes be obnoxious in their behavior. And it's very embarrassing. And I feel like taking these people and shaking them. People have had this experience many times about people who won't sit next to a woman on an airplane and things of that. It's very difficult to not to be upset in situations like this. Yes, we have to be proud that we have to be Jewish, but Jewish pride should also include derech eretz, proper behavior, and not to do anything that reflects negatively. So in addition to dressing in a certain way, your behavior is equally important. And even though it may not be obvious to everybody else, other Jews look at it and they may be embarrassed. So clearly you can dress Jewishly as long as it doesn't impact your safety. If safety is an issue, again, wearing a yarmulke in public, wearing tzitzis out, may not be a good idea in certain neighborhoods and in certain countries, and on certain campuses even today. I have an article in the link about that this week. The situation on college campuses today is very, very sad. In any event, I like the slogan from Madison Avenue. Think Jewish, dress British, think Yiddish. I like that. Dress so, wear whatever you want to wear. Be proud of being Jewish, and hopefully it won't become a problem. Any questions?
Wally.
Yes.
I remember back in the early 70s when I used to pave the street, walking up and down from one employment agency to another. Back then, that's what you had to do. You didn't have what you had today.
Yes.
Right? To kind of find a job and spending sometimes months trying to find something. And I spoke to my cousin who was a rabbi. He said, you know what? I'm just telling you a word of advice. The best thing is when you're going to look for a job, maybe the best thing is not at that point in time, not to wear a yarmulke. And at that point, I made a decision that I took off my yarmulke and I was able to find something.
Yeah.
Eventually, years go by, and it's very hard one day just to come in and wear your yarmulke, even though you feel comfortable already there because you might have been there 10 or 20 years to put on a yarmulke.
Yeah.
Let me tell you that in the story. So what happens? God always helps you out when you have something on your mind that you really want to do. Eventually, towards the end of my employment, like the last couple of years, I was actually made the commissioner. I started from the lowest level job. I made myself all the way up to commissioner. And the first thing that I did was I went to the chairperson of the board and said, I just want to give you a heads up. The next time you're going to see me, I'm wearing a yarmulke. I don't want you to be surprised. But that was the first thing that I did in terms of dealing with the chair. And she respected me for that. But then you have to, because there was no one above me at that point of time to say anything to me, but it's something I always wanted to do. And I was able to do it. Yeah.
No, this is a very, very real situation. And there are many people today. The head of the department himself might be wearing the yarmulke when people are going for an interview, because things have changed. Things have changed. But clearly, not so long ago, when you went for a job interview, not only wear yarmulke, but issues like Shabbos, it was always a big problem. Getting off early in the wintertime. And when my daughter was working for a big firm on Wall Street, so she used to leave in the wintertime around 2:00, get home in time for Shabbos. There was another guy in the department, a frum guy. In the wintertime, he would leave at 12:00. And they asked my daughter, how come in the summertime he also leaves at 12:00? Which was not a very nice thing to do, because he was taking advantage
Want to go to the country.
in a way that didn't reflect well on Shomer Shabbos people. But clearly this is the problem. My granddaughter now is very lucky. She works for a firm owned by Sephardic Jews. So she has no trouble at all with Chol HaMoed, with Shabbos. It's a breeze. She loves it. She loves it. In any event,
Wally,
yeah.
Why weren't Miriam's and Aaron's bones taken to Israel?
Good question. Well, it's a good question. I guess by that time, Miriam was buried somewhere in the desert. I don't know where. And Aaron was up on a mountain in Har HaHor.
So is Moshe.
Yeah, but Moshe, we don't know where he was buried.
Right.
So the whole question is theoretical. If Hashem wanted Moshe's bones to be taken back to Eretz Yisrael, he would have let them know where he was buried, I suppose.
Exactly.
But I guess for Moshe, there were different issues there, because for Moshe, it would become a pilgrimage site. It would become almost, I mean, I don't know. Being who he was, I guess Moshe's grave, if you've ever been to the grave of, who was it? The Ari in Sfat.
Yeah.
The Ari's yard site, I think, is the 16th of Tammuz. And the grave, the cemetery in Sfat is on a hillside. It's a very lousy location for a cemetery. It's on a hill. And a lot of great tzaddikim are buried there. And the Ari, people come from all over Israel, all over the world, as a pilgrimage to his grave. You can't get near it. You can't get near it. As a matter of fact, there's a guy who's there all night long into the next day, and his entire job is just chipping away all the wax that formed a mountain from all the candles that were left burning. It becomes a pilgrimage site, and sometimes the behavior of the cemetery isn't always appropriate. So maybe that's why we didn't bring Moshe's back. But anyway, I can't question the Medrash. That's what we have to deal with what we have. And what we have is why Yosef's bones were taken, but not Moshe's. It was just the point. The point being that he didn't correct Zipporah's daughter, Yisro's daughters, to say that he was a Jew, not an Egyptian. Again, the Medrash is being quoted not so much to answer your question of why he wasn't buried in Israel, but to point out that he should have identified himself as a Jew. That was the only reason why I brought that down.
Okay.
Anything else? Okay, Jewish pride. That's what we got to do.
Okay, Wally,
Yes.
what bothers me very often is that people who identify and flaunt how Jewish they are, with their tzitzis hanging out, etc., they act inappropriately, which makes more of a chilul Hashem than anything else.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, so if you dress like a Jew, very obviously, and you have your tzitzis hanging out, like we used to do in camp. We went to, or even people go to a Great Adventure. If you're online, you're wearing your tzitzis and your yarmulke, don't cut lines. That creates more of a chilul Hashem than anything else. And unfortunately, too many people do that.
It bothers me. The place where it really bothers me, if you go to a concert sometimes, a Chol Hamoed concert or a Sphira or any concert, large numbers of people are gathered together to hear an entertainer. Be quiet while he's singing. You can't hear the guy sing. There's always talking. I mean, it's just rude. It's simply rude behavior. I have no tolerance for that, and I don't understand why it even takes place. You come to a concert, you want to hear somebody, don't talk to your neighbor. Let the guy sing. It's terribly rude. But unfortunately, I remember once going to a conference of educators, and we discussed this issue of derech eretz, of proper behavior. And somebody made the observation, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I guess it might be under certain circumstances. The further away you get from New York, the more properly behaved people are. I don't know if it's always true, but I can see it. If you go out of town sometimes, they're a little bit better behaved.
I agree. I agree with that 100%. Yes.
It's just very, I don't know why. I don't know why it's tolerated. I don't know why it's allowed to I don't know why they do it. It's just rude behavior, period. There's no excuse for it. And certainly it's a chilul Hashem when you're obviously observant in the way you dress. It just is bad. It's very bad, and it hurts everybody else. And I agree. Hopefully this will be something that in the coming year, maybe the Jewish people will do tshuva for and change their behavior. Yeah. We could hope. Anything else? All right. Have a Gemar Chasima Tova, a good Shabbos, happy, healthy, prosperous year for everybody.
Gemar Chasima Tova to everybody. Have a good Shabbos.
Yanis, it's good to see you.